Hi, we move into 2 Samuel 4 today as we continue in this unit that began at 2:1 and goes through 5:5, exploring the transition after the death of Saul and Jonathan to the reign of David over the house of Judah and the house of Israel in 5:5. As we've been seeing, we've last looked at the death of Abner after Abner had attempted to make a covenant with David, but Joab found out and had him killed. And the text indicates twice that the reason for Joab killing him is not to protect David from a rival in the house of Saul, but as vengeance for Abner's killing of Joab's brother Abishai that we saw earlier. So his brother Asahel, Abishai is still alive, was part of this presence as we saw. So now out of nowhere we see this scene that comes as a surprise and is presented as a surprise of Baanah and Rehab. And if you don't know it, let's just go through it with the surprise in mind so you can see how the drama works. As we've been also looking at, we've been following the links between this section and the unit in 15:19, chapters 15 and 19, the rebellion of Absalom. And here the Benjaminites are a key element. We see that the people involved here are described as Benjaminites, and it's the last time we're going to see them in this unit, and then we'll see them 3 times elsewhere in 2 Samuel, but also 3 times in 15 to 19. Another thing we've been looking at that is also important here is the designation of those claiming David's royal authority. And here the issue is all Israel that we see on the left side in 4:1. And we've seen all Israel just a few verses earlier with a different response. We'll have to look at that. But we've also seen the house of Israel, the elders of Israel that Abner came to make the offer, and all the people a number of times, especially 13 times in these chapters. So we have to see how those relate, especially since all Israel would tend to refer to those who had been loyal to Saul. And Saul was a Benjaminite, and these people are Benjaminites. And yet, I'm sorry, spoiler here, they're going to end up responsible for the death of Saul's son Ishbaal, or Ishbosheth in Sheth in other translations. And so we have to explore why is that? Why the Benjaminites? And notice the Benjaminites are not named anywhere as the people who claim David's royal authority, and here they are acting on, they think, on his behalf. They are acting on his behalf, but whether he thinks so or not is what we'll see next time. And because this chapter is so short, it's really just these 2 scenes. There are a lot of keywords, but the ones that are there are important. And one is both the location, Beeroth, and also the fact that these 2 are named 3 times in a short passage as the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite. We know nothing about Rimnon, but we know something about Beeroth that may be a clue from later in the book. And also then the body parts, head, hands, feet. Not used that many times, but it's highlighting that the feet of Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son, that we see here, Mephibosheth, is lame in his feet, and then we see the feet of the assassins of Ishbaal are cut off along with their hands and their head and posted in the city by the pool of Hebron, as we see there. So, with that in mind, let's go begin our story in 4:1, and notice it comes out, seemingly out of nowhere, with no transition here, out of David disclaiming that the sons of Zeruiah are too strong for him. What we saw is that he was too weak and they're too hard, literally hard there. It's translated as violent. And so now we get a whole new scene. When Saul's son Ishbaal heard, how did he hear? We don't know that. As far as we know, he's in Mahanaim still, and we can look at the map and see where that is, way up here, and the Hebron situation is down here. But it's interesting that in this scene, it's never mentioned exactly where Ishbaal is. It mentions, as I've noted several times, where his assassins are from, and it'll note where they go to in the next scene when they bring his body parts to David. But where he is interestingly not mentioned. We have to assume it's in Mahanaim, where Abner brought him earlier, and ostensibly made him king over Israel and over Benjamin. So as far as Ishbaal knows, he's still king. And yet somehow he's heard that Abner had died at Hebron. So the word has to go all the way from Hebron, presumably to Mahanaim, and we don't know how that is. Presumably somebody who was with Abner went back and told him, but it doesn't say. And then we hear his courage failed. There's some translation issues here. Literally, as Brueggemann suggests, his hand relaxed is the meaning, and Brueggemann takes it as he lost his grip on power. The root word here, spelled RPH, you can't pronounce it, is a few times, and let's look at one other so we can see how that plays out later near the end of 2 Samuel 24:16. Here the Lord relented, that's not the one here, now stay your hand. So here it is related to that as we saw back here in 4:1. So his hand failed, and all Israel was dismayed, or literally was terrified. And it's only one other time in 1 Samuel. Let's look back at that and see that one. This is the woman of Endor here, who had brought up Samuel, and when she saw him, that he was terrified, she said, or that Saul was terrified. So Saul was terrified at what Samuel had said, which is that he would die that day. And the Israelites have the same experience here when they hear that Abner died. But why? Why is Israel concerned about Abner dying if Ishbaal was the person that they had as their king because of Abner? And as we saw just a few verses earlier, let's go back and look at 337. All the people and all Israel, notice the pairing of two different groups here, all the people and all Israel, understood or literally knew that day that the king had no part in the killing of Abner, son of Ner. So if all Israel is on the side of David for recognizing that he had no part in the killing of Abner, but it was simply a matter of blood violence from the sons of Zeruiah in the person of Joab and Abishai, then why here are they terrified at Ishbaal's death? We don't have an answer to that, but plainly, or at Abner's death, I'm sorry, they plainly think that Abner was the force behind the throne, which he plainly was. And so perhaps they think that Ishbaal is nothing without Abner, and of course that's exactly the case, as we're going to see momentarily. He's going to be literally nothing at all in just a couple of verses. And then to maintain suspense so we don't know anything about what happens there, and then the story shifts dramatically to seeming like something completely different, and then it shifts again. So we have verse 2 that names these facts, and then it goes on in verse 2 and 3 after 3 to just change the subject again, as we'll see. So Saul's son, this is plainly Jonathan, had this is Ishbaal, plainly not Jonathan here, although it's not specified, it could have been, but plainly we're talking about Ishbaal. So Saul's son Ishbaal had two captains of raiding bands using Sar, which I noted when it was in David's lament over Abner was translated wrongly as prince, and it means captain or commander, as we saw. So they're of the same status as Abner was in terms of being Sar, plural. Captains of raiding bands here. As the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon suggests, the marauding band are troops of mercenaries, which is to say not like regular soldiers, but more like bandits. And it highlights that there's not a war going on. This is just raiding bands as opposed to people leading in war. So people out there just to support the treasury, I suppose, by getting spoil, although that's not named here specifically. The name of the one is Banah, and the name of the other is Rahab. They are sons of Rimmon, a Benjaminite from Beeroth. For Beeroth is considered to belong to Benjamin. And notice that the writer has to repeat that for emphasis to draw our attention to the relationship between this town Beeroth and the person from it, Rimmon, and Benjamin. So we need to look at some details. Rimmon, we don't know. Benjamin, or literally sons of Benjamin, perhaps this is inspired by 3:19. Let's look back at that. Abner spoke, as we saw earlier, in the ears of the Benjaminites, but we didn't hear what they were ready to do. But the narrator told us at the time Abner went to tell David all that Israel and the whole house of Benjamin were ready to do. Notice Benjamin separate from Israel. We presume that what they're ready to do is anoint David in place of Saul there as king over Israel, but we don't hear that directly. We just hear that indirect statement of what they're ready to do. But Beeroth is the key here, as Brooke Halpern notes. As a town, it may belong to Benjamin, but it's a Gibeonite town, as we see in Joshua, and I won't get in the details of that. You can look at that up here yourself. We don't know exactly where it is, but the key is in 23:37 in 2 Samuel. So let's look at that for a moment. In this litany of names at the very end, we don't need to see the rest of it. We see Zelach the Ammonite, Nahari of Beeroth, the armor bearer of Joab, son of Uriah. And then we also see Uriah the Hittite, of course, the one whom David had killed, the husband of Bathsheba. But we know that somebody from Beeroth is working as Joab's armor bearer. So perhaps that indicates what I've been suggesting as from other scholars earlier, that there was this fourth column of Benjaminites who saw that Saul had lost it. Not just lost his grip on power, but had lost it mentally, as we'd seen earlier in 1 Samuel, and had decided that David was really the anointed of Yahweh to rule over them. But we don't know all that, and we don't know if the Beerothite, who's mentioned in chapter 23, has the same ideology as Rimmon here, whom we know nothing about. But the text goes on to give us another clue. Before we get there, Beerath is considered to belong to Benjamin, a word that is expressing an opinion rather than a fact. We see an example of that in Joshua 13:3. We see here, these towns are reckoned as Canaanite, but it might have been Philistine, which is to say borders were not sharp and clear in the ancient world as they are now, and properties and places would move back and forth as empires and local leaders came and fell, as we know. So now the narrator adds another detail, and there's no particular reason to have this verse in parentheses. It's verse 4 that seems more likely to be in parentheses. It's about something completely different. Verse 3 just simply continues with more detail about than verse 2. As Halpern suggests, that this is a historical fleeing from Saul, which sets up what happens, what's described here. The people of Beerath had fled, recalling David fleeing from Saul 3 times back in 1 Samuel, and the next fleeing will be Absalom fleeing, and then David fleeing from Absalom. So plainly, these various fleeings are political fleeings in the face of the risk of death. Fled to Gittaim, which is only in Nehemiah 11:33 described as part of Benjamin. So even if Beerath is questionably part of Benjamin, Gittaim, at least in the exilic and post-exilic period described in Nehemiah, is described as part of Benjamin there, but not necessarily part of Israel, and maybe that's the point. And they are there as resident aliens, as Gorim here, a Gur being a resident alien or an immigrant, to this day. The question is, which to this day? And that's the question I've been begging with various scholars who see different sources and argue about when this whole drama was written. And this verse doesn't help us answer that, but it certainly is naming explicitly to the day of the author's writing it, presumably is this day that's being referred to there. But we don't know when that is. Now verse 4, and if we look at key words, we really see the difference. It's a completely separate thing. And we have to wonder why that's there now, and I'll show you the path that it leads to. So, as my note below has inserted within the Ishbaal story to set up Ishbaal's potential successor, Saul's son Jonathan had a son. This is the first time we know he has a son, the first time we know he had a woman to produce a son. We never heard anything about that, which is an interesting omission. That we'd seen the close relationship between Jonathan and David, and back in those chapters in 1 Samuel, I explored some of the modern scholarly tradition, exploring whether that might be a gay relationship between the two of them, and scholars disagree about that, not just because some are against the idea of that, but because the evidence is ambiguous on its face. But in any event, Jonathan had a son, it says, and again, doesn't say who the mother is, who was crippled in his feet. And the interesting order is it tells us that, then it tells us how that happened. We don't really need to know how it happened, but it spends more time telling us how it happened than the fact of it. So it must have been important to the author. He was about 5 years old, when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, which is to say the news of their death, which makes us a flashback to the end of 1 Samuel and the beginning of 2 Samuel, to the incident that is described here. His nurse picked him up. There's no word for nurse in the Hebrew, but it's implied by the verb here for picked him up, the unpronounceable without a vowel here, which means to be carried or supported by somebody important. Here is a guardian, in Isaiah as a nurse. So it's the act of being picked up by somebody who cares for you. Picked him up and fled. Continuing the theme of these people fleeing, it's not clear exactly why they're fleeing other than the fact that Saul and Jonathan are dead, but why would that mean that Jonathan's son would need to be running away? David didn't kill Jonathan. David lamented loudly and publicly over the death of Saul and Jonathan. Jonathan was one of his best friends. Would David really go about the process of killing his best friend's son? We'll find out. And in her haste to flee, it happened that he fell and became lame. The word for lame here, interesting, Pasuk, as in Passover, as in Pesach, exact same word used in Exodus. So it's used for passing over there, and it's only a couple times in the rest of the Deuteronomistic history. And then finally, as an afterthought, we hear his name is Mephibosheth. So that is all inserted, and then it goes back to the sons of Rimmon. So let's pause for a moment, and I won't go through it in detail, but note that there is a Mephibosheth story in 2 Samuel spread out pretty equally around. Notice chapter 4, chapter 9, chapter 16, chapter 19, and finally chapter 21. And I've just bolded the parts that indicate the line of the story. Just look briefly at the bolded parts so we can see what the story is that emerges from the entire rest of 2 Samuel. So after our immediate scene, we hear several chapters later in chapter 9, after David is well established, the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat, but your master's grandson Mephibosheth shall always eat at my table. Which is to say, David is making him a comfortable prisoner. He's not going to kill him, but he's going to keep him at the table where he can keep watching him. And a similar thing happens later in Kings, where other rivals are held at the king's table. So this was actually a traditional alternative to assassinating people, was to treat them well enough that they would be grateful that they're alive and eating at your table until something else happens. But nothing else happens, as we'll see as the story follows. So we continue down to chapter 16, which is in the midst of the Absalom rebellion. And as David had passed a little over the summit, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him, and the king said, "Where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "He remains in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom.'" Which is to say, he's still holding on to the idea that he's going to be the successor to Saul at some point. Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." But after the end of the Absalom rebellion, there's another opportunity where Mephibosheth comes to meet David. And the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me?" And he said, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me." Presumably that servant was Ziba, but he doesn't name that servant. You would think he might have more than one servant, but he doesn't say one of his servants. Anyway, whoever it is, he says, deceived him. And David believes it enough to say, "I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land." And then finally, the dark ending to the story in chapter 21, after the rebellion is put down and David is reestablished as king, the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath that Yahweh that was between David and Jonathan, son of Saul, which is to say, not because of Yahweh, but because of his oath with Jonathan. The king took the two sons of Rizpah, who we saw just a chapter before that Abner had gone in to Rizpah to challenge Ishbaal's claim to the monarchy. When Ishbaal challenged him, Abner went over to David. These sons of Rizpah are not from Abner, though, as you see, they're a daughter of Ai, whom she bore to Saul here. And then the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, his other daughter, Michal, we find out in chapter 6, has no child with David. So these are the last remaining descendants of Saul, and he has them impaled on the mountain before Yahweh. So Mephibosheth gets to live, but all the others get to die by the time the entire book is over. So that returns us to our story here in verse 5, as we continue with the sons of Rimmon. And they set out, and about the heat of the day, they came to the house of Ishbaal, which is to say, trying to take advantage of his normal siesta time, repeated both the heat of the day while he's taking his noonday rest. And I feel the need to point out, to help show how a good interpretation is separate from a bad one, not just which opinion fits you or me, but which makes sense of the evidence and doesn't impose exterior prejudices on top. And Robert Barron is my classic example of someone who certainly knows what he's saying is not true here and says it anyway to fit his notion. He says the image of sleeping in the middle of the day suggests weakness, even corruption, even though plainly any even beginning scholar knows that anywhere where it's hot in the Middle East or elsewhere, it's totally normal and healthy to take your rest in the day. And interestingly, with great irony, Barron does this because he wants David to be his great hero, and everybody who opposes David is somehow the great Satan. As he literally named Abner as the serpent in the preceding passage. But here, ironically, the next person who's taking a noonday rest is David, who wakes up from that and then sees Bathsheba on his neighbor's roof. So interestingly, Barron is hoist on his own petard because David is an example of what he calls here weakness, even corruption. But it's not. It's just normal. And so they're taking advantage of that, and they came into the house of Ishbaal. And verses 6 and 7 are difficult in the Hebrew, and as Robert Alter notes here, following the Septuagint, which has this, "And look, the woman who kept the gate had been gleaning wheat and nodded and fell asleep. Then they came into the bedchamber and the house," etc. And as Alter notes, the translation of this entire verse follows the text reflected in the Septuagint, and reluctantly, out of the sense that the received text at this point is simply not viable, which is to say the Masoretic text, and another scholar says the same thing. So we can't look at the Hebrew in detail here for a lot of help, but we can at least see what the story is trying to tell us. And notice in verse 7, it suggests a different version of what happens in verse 6. "So they came inside the house as though to take wheat," which doesn't make a lot of sense there, but that's where the Septuagint is different. "And they struck him in the stomach, just like Abner was struck in the stomach, and just like Abner struck Asahel in the stomach." So the whole sequence of stomach stabbings, although in verse 7 it says they attacked him, killed him, and beheaded him, and doesn't mention that. They can both be possible, of course. And then they escape. Doesn't say where they escaped to or who they escaped from. Presumably Ishbaal has somebody guarding him, but there's nobody there in this scene. Did they bribe them? We just don't know. Note the scene as described in verse 7 here is not that different than how the king Ehud in Judges dies in his, not in his bedchamber, but in his cool chamber, just say his toilet area, when Ehud comes in and takes advantage of the fact that he's left-handed to bring in a weapon to kill him. It's a similar kind of thing here, which makes, at one level, Rahab and Baanah look like people in the books of Judges, killing bad guys, but that's not how David's going to perceive it. So we continue in the verse 7 version. Now they come into the house while he was laying on his couch in the bedchamber. The word for lying, as Levine notes below, the only uses of the phrase, none of which involve women or sexuality. So there's no sense that this is a sexual scene, but simply that he's sleeping in the day. And they attacked him, killed him, and beheaded him. Literally, and took his head. And they took his head and traveled by way of the Arabah all night long, which is to say, from Mahanaim all the way down this way, going to Hebron, expecting to be rewarded by the king for destroying the grandson of his enemy. But that's not exactly what's going to happen, and we'll see that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.